saxophonist, absolutely amazing guy. So she sold it to Melody Maker, and she said that started it. Then she started writing for the American jazz magazine Downbeat. But I did remember that she'd interviewed the Beatles, which was completely sidetracked from what she was known for and doing at that time. She said, oh yes, I went to this television programme called Ready, Steady, Go, which was the first ever rock programme on television on the BBC in the 60s. And she said, I was interviewing an African musician who was in the audience, and through that I met the Beatles. And then she says, oh well, I met John Lennon when he was on the set of Help, the movie, and we sat down on a mattress and talked, and the title in the Melody Maker was How I Write My Songs by Val Wilmer. And she said that she talked to Jimi Hendrix. And the thing about that was interesting, because everybody wanted to talk to Jimi Hendrix at that time. He was the leading guitarist. Of course, you know all about him. And she said she was the first person that talked to him about the blues, because as a black musician, she was interested in his background and his context in America. She said nobody had ever talked to him about the blues. They all treated him as a rock musician. They treated him as a white musician. And she wrote a very interesting book, an autobiography called As Serious as Your Life, which explained how she'd explored it. She would travel into the deep south and she'd go to people's houses, knock on the doors and find out and track the chart and the kind of family tree of all the blues musicians. And she did this, really the driving force was her interest in the music and in their life stories. On a more kind of recent thing, I talked to a young guy called David Smith. Now, I first knew David when I was working at the Telegraph on the arts desk. But he came in and he did work experience, and he was replacing the previous person who'd been doing work experience called Caspar Llewellyn Smith, who is now editor of the Observer Music Monthly. And Caspar established the precedent of being a work experience person. Never have an answer machine, because then if you're an editor, never have an answer machine, because then the work experience person has to take your calls. And if you don't reply to anybody, you blame them. He did another thing which was quite good. He made sure that he didn't make the tea, and that was quite unusual. I've never known a work experience person not be in charge of making the tea. And so, what he did do, which was really extraordinary, was he mentored the work experience person. So the work experience people would be, the ones that are interested in music would give him reviews, and he would viciously, savagely dissect them and make them into proper prose, and basically taught them how to write, only the ones that had real interest and enthusiasm. And from Caspar Llewellyn Smith, this guy David Smith, no relation, David Smith stayed on and there was a kind of lucky break. Somebody was away, he wrote some reviews and they were published in the paper. He was sent off to do a gig. He said that people at the Telegraph were older and they had kids, and they sent me out at night because they didn't want to go out. But and then after a few months, the editor said to him, you better leave, there's nothing here for you. So somebody else from the Telegraph had gone to the Evening Standard by then. Now this might sound a kind of incestuous thing, but it is kind of one of the ways it works. You get a chain of people going from one place to another who've seen who are the good people who are undervalued, and I'm sure this happens in radio. I know it happens in radio and in TV. One of the sub-editors from the Telegraph went to be the arts editor at the Evening Standard, and he says, I sent her a jokey email. Now this is quite risky actually. The email, the first thing to do in your new job is to sack the rock reviewer. He's rubbish. She did, and he said he hired her. He said it's rather underhand, but it's dog eat dog in this world, so he got the job. And actually he's a really good writer. I don't know if I've got any, I think I've got one of his here. Yeah, there's one of his stories here about massive attack. So he's got half a page. He is now the rock critic for the Evening Standard. So through him, at the Christmas drinks for the Evening Standard arts desk last year, I met this really pushy guy called Rick. And the arts editor said, oh, this guy bombarded me with reviews for the last 2 years. In the end, we said, okay, you can have a work experience type, editorial assistant type job. Now, his story is really interesting, and I think it's something that all famous writers should be listening to. He says, when I was at school, Will Self came into the school. This is, I think, in Cardiff. He got us to write a story, and he liked mine, and he gave me his email address. He said he would have given anybody his email address, but I was the only one who responded. Out of the whole class, he was the only one that responded to this incredible offer. So I sent him reviews, and he said he'd corrected and edited it, and he sent suggestions to me. He said, I bombarded him. This word keeps coming up. But he said he was a real mentor, and he got an internship at the NME while he was at Cardiff doing English at Cardiff University. And he said, anyone can do that at the NME. They take undergraduates in full-time education. You just open the post. but they also give you the chance to write a single review, and you've got 3 days to write it. That's quite interesting. When I do reviews, I've sometimes got 3 hours. But they've got 3 days to write it, and they do read it. And he said it gives you a chance to see how a magazine works. And I think that's one of the things, you know, if you're doing, it's quite mystifying how these things are put together, and it's quite scary to know what goes on when you're talking to them on the end of the phone, and how, if you've worked inside a publication, you really understand the hierarchy, the rules, and all the games that go on and so on. So he said he got this, and they did use some of his things. Then he got into Mojo and work experience, and he said it snowballs, you know, your CV looks good. And then Will Self, who has a column in the Evening Standard, got him in, and he asked the arts editor if he could go along with the music critic David Smith to some of the gigs, and he said he did, and that's how he kind of moved on to doing it. But as the editor herself said, he bombarded. He wrote and wrote and wrote stuff for them and sent it all in, and he's now got a job in publishing, doing some editing. And he says he does about 1 review a week. He gets them published in the Evening Standard. But he said, at the moment, I'm just writing scratch cards and rollovers. It's not quite so glamorous. I just come out of a 4.5-hour meeting about scratch cards. So he's not quite doing what he wants yet, but he's in because he's got these things being published. So I then talked to David Smith, who'd mentored him, about the process. And I think interesting things come out of what he says as well, because he said he would send me these reviews and I would write back to him and give him advice, as Casper had done to me. And he said, the last time I wrote to him, I said, you don't need any more tips, you're there. And he said, I often had to look after work experience people for the week, and they were usually bored and terrified, and nobody gave them any work, and they're usually in the way, but you've got to help. You need to give something back. And he said, it's all still fresh in my mind how hard it can be for beginners, but some people are pushy and demand to write the front page. There's a fine line between being pushy and being annoying. So what I'm doing now is carrying on doing exactly what I've always done, which is a whole mixture of things. I think I get bored very easily. So I write print stories like that. I do a radio programme now. I do a lot of radio. I started in the 80s when I lived in New York, and I did a cassette radio for university colleges called Bug Radio. And we recorded it in a tiny studio in New York, 2 of us. And we had live guests in, so we had Laurie Anderson and David Byrne and Sue Steward when he was in town. And then also they paid for me to go to Istanbul and do a week-long programme in Turkey about the music in Istanbul. And it was paid for by TDK Cassettes, and it went out to all the universities in the States. And it was really interesting, and it was a really great basis for me to do it, because it was sort of amateur but not. And so I learnt about, I didn't do any editing, which I really regret. I never learnt how to edit. But I did learn how to present a programme, produce it, put a shape of a programme together. And I now do British Airways in-flight radio as their arts correspondent, because I now write about photography and art as well. And I do Radio 3's World Roots programme on a regular basis, and I go on Woman's Hour sometimes, because I've got this kind of specialist area. And really, I've got to the point where I'm sick of writing little things like this in the Evening Standard that are 300 words long, and I like writing big features like Sid and Nancy, but I'm really writing books as well, because writing this salsa book changes the way that you're treated if you write a book. You're suddenly seen in a different category. You'd know this, and it's sort of accepted, but it's bloody hard work and it's a nightmare. But once you've done it, it's great. So I'm writing a couple of books at the moment. I'm doing a biography of a musician called Edmundo Ross, who was the first Latin American music salsa band leader in England. He's now 97. And I'm doing, surprise, surprise, kind of autobiographical stories about my life in music, including the Sex Pistols. So, over to you. What can I tell you about the broadcast media? I haven't mentioned one thing. I worked in television as a producer of documentaries for the Arena series, BBC Arena series in the 80s. Documentaries about Latin American music, salsa and African music. And a Channel 4 programme called Big World Cafe about world music, which was live. And I also did a series called Rhythms of the World. I made some programmes for that as well. And when I did the documentaries, I did a documentary in, it was an interesting thing actually. It was called 7 Nights in New York City, and it was about how 6 communities in New York, Russian, Korean, Haitian, Dominican and Greek, how they maintain ties with their homeland, which they may never have lived in or been to, how they maintain ties with the homeland through food, music and religion. And it was very interesting because basically we just submerged ourselves in each culture for the few days that we were filming. And I spent 2 weeks doing the recce and stuff like that. And I think that to present the story, you've got to present it from the inside. So I have kind of dabbled in all areas of the media. And I think that really is the most exciting part of it. You know, you just want to get into it and find out what it's all about everywhere. So anyway, yes.
You said that you tend to nowadays write things about the past and artists that you interviewed back then.
No, I don't. No, that was for this. Of course I write about things from the past, and this is an example. And I'm very interested in history, so I always bring in the historical perspective of people I write about if it's a big feature. But no, I mean, I write about past things, but I'm writing it this week on the Chinese super pop star, Sa Dingding, who has won the BBC World Music Awards this year, and she's 23 and she's going to be a big superstar. No, I keep up with stuff, yeah.
In England, is she going to be big? Do you think she's going to transcend?
Well, she could, because she's not doing, it's not folky, she's absolutely amazingly, stunningly good looking. She might be in here.
She's in the Music Monthly, the top 10.
She is actually, she's in that, yeah. And yes, she will be big. She's won the Asian category of the BBC World Music Awards, and I was one of the judges, and I had to defend her. I put her forward as one of the winners. She is really superb. But she sings in a kind of quite crossover, new agey way, but also she's Mongolian, so she has a Mongolian singing in it and Chinese things as well. It's a real mix-up, but it's got dance beats, and it's very of today, you know. I think she will be.
What do you think about programmes like The Culture Show, who kind of trying to make music and arts a bit more accessible, but then at the same time making it trendy Hoxton type for the masses?
Well, I have a real mixed feeling about The Culture Show, because I think that the amount of and the level of TV broadcasting about arts generally and culture generally is terrible, is atrocious in this country. And I think The Culture Show is a real dumbed-down version of what has been in the past. It is really that, and the late night Newsnight Review are the only things where things are discussed in any depth. Apart from Desi DNA, the Asian programme, which I think is superb, they do things, but that's a specific specialist thing, really late and so on. It's a great programme. I think it visually and what they do and what they cover is great, but it's almost patronising. I mean, the way they took. Do you think that? Do you think it is? Yeah, and it should be aiming at you. I mean, it's as if they're doing junior school art or something. So I feel quite disappointed, well, very disappointed by it, yeah.
Do you find, or is it challenging writing about something that's audio for print? Like, if you're trying to talk about some sort of music, you don't have the benefit of, say, the radio or TV where you can hear sound. How do you get around that?
What do you mean? Just having it like written in here?
Yeah. Like if you're writing about South American music or world music, do you describe? Is it descriptive of how it sounds like? Or?
Yeah. I think it's quite difficult to write descriptive, but I think it is really important to give it some impression of what it's like. And I think that took me the longest to train myself how to do it, really. And I think partly because I worked with people who are kind of free improvisers, and it's a sort of poetic thing. It almost becomes like poetry, writing about it, what it sounds like and how it. But I also write about photography and art, you see, and I love that because I'm moving between two things, and the same kind of analysis applies, really. It is quite difficult. I think it's important. People want to know what it sounds like, you know, that's why you're reading. But also the biographical and story of the person is important, I think, and the context it comes out of, especially when you're talking about somebody from China, or in fact this woman lived 6 years in Mongolia, then moved to Beijing, and her granny was Mongolian and brought her up. Absolutely affects her singing. You can't write about somebody like that without saying that, you know. But then you have to say what the singing sounds like.
Yeah, that's what I thought would be challenging, because with radio you just play the music and then write something else. But here you have to go into the difficulty, which I could imagine you might.
But on radio, I mean, I do this Radio 3 programme, World Roots, and I did it this week actually. for a week on Saturday. It'll be broadcast. And you do talk about it. The theme was Brazilian music, and the three of us discussed CDs that we were reviewing, and you get stuck into talking about the music.
Yeah.
It's not just about telling who the person is. Yeah.
Okay, well look, let's just thank Sue for a very interesting talk.
Thanks very much. Thanks.